In our previous videos, we've been looking at different types of qualitative research methods. So we looked at focus groups, and in this video, we're going to look at interviews. So let's just start by defining the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. When we talk about quantitative research, we're talking about research. Get my writing tool here. Research that uses mathematical analysis. So with quantitative research like surveys, we can figure out what percentage of the group feel a certain way or have certain characteristics. And so we can use math like proportions, what percentage. We can look at and compare, let's say, the average height of one group to the average height of another. So in surveys and experiments, we can actually do math, so statistical tests to see if there's a difference between one group and another in terms of how they feel or in terms of measurements. So we can do that type of analysis. With qualitative methods, we are looking at methods that are going to focus more on text. And so we're analyzing text for themes, for common words that are used, but because they're very open-ended and people are giving what comes to the top of their head, we're using it for more exploratory research because we don't, just because someone didn't mention something a certain way or bring up a topic doesn't mean that that's not important to them. It's just that it wasn't on the top, it wasn't on the tip of their tongue. It wasn't the first thing that they thought of. So we can't make that kind of extrapolation that everyone else feels this way or we heard something being more important. It's just what people happen to think of. And so qualitative research is more for that exploration and brainstorming than it is for determining whether there's consensus and whether everyone feels the same way. So when we talk about qualitative research, we can define it as research that I don't remember how I defined it in the previous video. Research that focuses on text. But you could also write it as research that's not subject to quantification, right? So quantitative is the math, so qualitative is not the math. So here we're looking at text and we're looking at themes, and examples of qualitative research are going to be the focus groups that we talked about before and the interviews we're going to talk about today. Okay. So as we look at different types of qualitative research, we talked in our previous video about focus groups. We're going to focus in this video on in-depth interviews. So in-depth interviews are unstructured. So call it the focus group. We had a discussion guide, so you knew exactly what questions you were going to ask, although there was that flexibility to probe. And in this case, in an in-depth interview, your guidance would be even more general rather than a discussion guide with specific questions. You might just have general topics. And so it is a lot more unstructured. You go with what the interviewee wants to talk about relative to the topic or the reason that you're doing the research. So it is unstructured. And here we're doing one-on-one interviews. So nothing like defining a word with the same word. So we're having these one-on-one conversations that probe and elicit details of detailed answers. Unstructured one-on-one interviews that probe and elicit detailed answers to questions. And then we'll just write here, often using non-directive techniques. To uncover hidden motives. So the idea here is to leave it quite open, get them to tell you, ask for more information, an explanation, why they do that, why they feel a certain way. And so you are not necessarily leading them. So it's non-directive. We're very open. We're trying to explore why people think the way they do, why people feel the way they do, why people behave the way they do. Okay. In terms of marketing research, in-depth interviews are probably the second most popular form of qualitative research. It is more expensive than a focus group because you're doing one person at a time instead of groups of 8 to 12. If you are in more of the social sciences or psychology, then interviews are probably the most popular form of qualitative research that you are conducting. So let's talk about how these interviews work. So we could contact a person over the phone, over Teams or Zoom, or do it in person. And the key here is to encourage people to provide as much information as possible. Typically, your interviews are 30 minutes to an hour, allowing them to talk on a particular topic and then you probing, asking additional questions to explore it in more depth. When you're doing interviews, often what you want to do is choose participants who are as different from each other as possible. So the idea is as we're brainstorming, we're getting ideas, we want diverse ideas. So we might be picking different individuals that represent different groups. So for example, if I want to interview instructors about what they do to engage students, then I might pick someone who teaches in science and someone who teaches in trades and someone who teaches in business, somebody who teaches in nursing, right? I want a variety of different perspectives and different approaches. So we would often pick to represent kind of the different cohorts of different groups within our population. We could ask different questions to different participants, right? We talked about if you do focus groups and you're doing multiple focus groups for the same client for the same topic, you want your questions to be somewhat similar since you're trying to get information from that group to help you brainstorm or answer. You have certain questions that you're trying to get to. In in-depth interviews, you might have different questions. And as we said, that you don't even necessarily have a discussion guide. You have kind of general topic you want to talk about. Maybe you have outlined just a handful of questions, but that interview could really go different directions depending on what kind of information they're providing to you. So we're using for exploration. And if you're doing exploratory research with interviews, you probably only have, 10 to 20 interviews that are your entire study. So a much smaller sample size than say when we do surveys and we have hundreds of respondents. Okay. So when would you use in-depth interviews? If you are doing it from a social science psychology perspective, when we are talking about personal experiences and they are things that are much more personal or sensitive, that are more emotional, people may not want to convey that information in front of others. So the focus group may not be as conducive. Remember, the benefit of the focus group is that people will feed off of each other. So if you're brainstorming, one person raises an issue and then another person says, oh yeah, that's a priority for me too. And so that creates that richer environment. But if you're asking for information that people typically aren't willing to share in front of others, then interviews are more appropriate. And so that's why we see interviews in more of that psychology and social science setting. In the business setting, where we see interviews is where we are asking executives, leaders within organizations about strategy and why they do things. So if you think about it, the owners of multiple competing companies are not going to sit in a room and do a focus group where they talk about why their company does certain things. You don't want to share that information in front of the competition. So what we have are executive interviews where you go and you talk with the leader of one organization about their strategies, and then you go and talk with another leader of an organization about their strategies. And then when you are doing your analysis, your recommendations, your report, it's anonymous. You're very generally describing what type of business or what type of executive you have, but you're not identifying the actual business itself. So it creates that confidentiality and anonymity at least in your presenting of your findings. Now, other things you could use interviews for is you could instead of doing a focus group where people review a TV advertisement or a print ad, you could have individuals review it. That's less common. You could use interviews to do a bit of taste testing or sampling of products. Again, those are often done in a focus group setting where you say, okay, here, try that. Let's look at this new product and give us your thoughts, describe it. The benefit, of course, is that people are building off of each other, but you could do that in an interview setting. So we could use it to understand products, services, or ideas. We could use it to test out new products or prototype. We could use it to research packaging, how effective or opinions about the package or a use of the product. Those are examples of interviews, but often because that can be done in a focus group and where you can get more feedback. So at 1 hour, you get feedback from 8 to 12 people instead of one. We often use the interviews for more strategy and things they don't want to convey in front of others. When it comes to our interviews, there are different types of interviews. There are some special cases, right? And so we'll look at a couple of those over the next couple videos. But one that we often see is customer care research. So this is a special type of in-depth interview to help understand the process that people take. And so there are kind of these key questions and a formalized process for this type of interview. So in this case, what we're doing is we're asking about how someone eventually purchased a product. And so we would start with the question of what started you on the road to make this purchase. So you can think about, you bought a vehicle, you bought an F-150, and so we would call you and want to learn about how you ultimately decided what to purchase. So we phone you up and we say, okay, well, why did you decide that you were going to purchase a vehicle? What started you on that path? Okay, and then we ask, well, why now? Why are you making that purchase now? Maybe it's because, the other car died. Maybe it's because there was a promo going on that made it more appealing to pull the trigger. And then we ask about the process. What was the hardest part of the process? So we're using this particular method of interview when there are multiple steps to make a purchase. If it is something like buying a candy bar at the grocery store, we wouldn't do this type of interview. And in fact, in that case, where it's something people don't even think of and they just do automatically, observational research is more relevant. If it is something people do think about, but they don't think about too hard, then surveys are sufficient, right? We could ask about, how often they buy candy bars at the grocery store. So we do this for complicated purchases, like the purchase of a house or purchase of a vehicle, things that people tend to research and take a lot of time to consider before they do. So what was the hardest part of the process? Is there anywhere where you got stuck? Okay, so we want them to kind of explain a bit of the process. How did you decide? So when and how did you decide the price was acceptable? So if we're thinking about a vehicle, did they go and look at the prices of other brands, other dealerships, and see that the price that Ford is offering for a truck is similar to Chevy, GM, all these others? And is that how they decided the price was acceptable? Maybe they did research. Where did they go to look? Was it online? Was it driving around town? How did they decide the price was acceptable? And when in the process did they make that decision? We could ask in terms of how the story behind the purchase, or if there was someone else involved in the process who could help describe the story. Did they consult family members? Was it so if it is a married couple, did they both decide? Is it one person who made the decision? So how is it that that they made this purchase? And if they made a similar purchase before, what we want to know is how this is different. So if they made the purchase before, how does the story of the purchase, the decision-making process, how is it different this time than it was the last time? And then at what point did you decide you trusted this organization, the company you actually bought it from? So at what point did you decide nothing like losing words, decide you trusted this organization and that salesperson to work with you? So for example, you go into a dealership, right? Did you get good vibes from a certain salesperson and that's how you decided to come back and work with them? Is it that that was the only salesperson who showed an interest and chatted with you? So why did you choose to buy from this dealership, from that salesperson? So how did you decide, that word is trusted, looks like twisted, trusted, that you trusted the organization and the salesperson to work with? Okay, so here in this particular case, because this type of interview is a bit standardized in terms of looking at a long decision to make a purchase, here the questions, we have a bit more of a discussion guide as to what to ask. And that would be true if we were looking at long-term purchases, but you could be using your interviews for lots of things, right? So you might be exploring why people choose to work with your organization, why people choose to donate to your nonprofit, why people seek out counseling supports, why people choose to use a particular nutrition supplement, right? So interviews can be used for all types of different things. Doesn't have to be specific to selling a product, but it's where the information, you need more details from each person, or where it is more sensitive in nature, and so they might not want to convey it in front of someone else. So we can get a lot more detail, of course, from an interview than a focus group, because you are spending the whole 30 minutes to an hour with one person, them giving you insights instead of listening to 8 to 12 people. So let's look at some advantages of doing an interview. Okay, so one is that the responses are not influenced by others. Right, so the benefit of the focus group was that they can feed off of each other, and then you get more information because it includes the things that other people haven't thought of. But here, if we want it to not be influenced by another person's comment, we would go with an interview. That helps in terms of the respondent will be more likely to provide you information because you are focused solely on them. So the respondent feels that their thoughts are important and wanted. So you've asked specifically for a specific person to provide you information, and that can help increase in terms of whether or not they are likely to participate in the research project. So instead of just, anybody fill out the survey, or, you're trying to let's fill seats in your focus group, Here you've often identified you may have put out a call for people to participate in your research, but you're reaching out and saying, okay, we want to hear from you specifically because you represent a certain group or a certain perspective. And so respondents feel their thoughts are important and wanted, and you, the researcher, are spending all of that time focused solely on them and their thoughts. So that respondent, right, has constant interaction with the researcher or the interviewer. Okay. You can devote a longer time to each respondent. All right, devote a longer time to a respondent, which encourages revelation of new information. Okay? Because you are spending the time focusing on that one person, probing, getting them to talk, then you are likely to go into different areas, different avenues with each individual. Because you are leaving it quite open and giving them the chance to talk uninterrupted for a longer period of time than we would with a focus group. And so we can then probe, allows for revealing of feelings and motivations. So again, we use interviews to figure out why people feel a certain way, why people act a certain way, getting them to dive deeper into the processes they take, the decisions that they make, why they feel a certain way that they do. Okay. Let's keep going. More advantages of interviews. We said that it is less structured or unstructured. So the line of questions are less rigid. Which means new directions of questions can be explored. So there's a bit of an improvisation to this in terms of you come in on a general topic, and then depending on the type of information they provide, you can move into different avenues with one participant than another. The interview, because you are doing this one-on-one, it is more sensitive to nonverbal feedback. You can identify when someone is excited about something or when something makes them uncomfortable, and then you can get them to explore that in more detail. Please explain, why this gets you so animated. Please explain why you're hesitant to respond to this. Walk me through your thoughts when we talk about this particular topic. So you can do more response to that nonverbal feedback. You do get a more detailed viewpoint. So we get a singular viewpoint without the influence of others. So you get how people truly feel and think, not the way they think others want them to act or behave, right? So the problem, of course, with a focus group is that when your responses are in front of other people, you are thinking, well, what will they think when I say this? Is that what is acceptable response? When it is an interview, then you can give your viewpoint. You're only really concerned with that interviewer and how they might react. So you might be more forthcoming and provide more truer responses than in a greater group. Now, a survey, an anonymous survey where people can write in their responses, where they don't even have to consider the interviewer or the researcher and how they might feel about or respond to something you say, an opinion you have, then they have even more freedom to truly respond based on how you feel. So as we design a research method, we really do need to be aware what is the topic that we are asking questions about, and how willing are people to either give those responses in front of a group, give those responses in front of one person. Does it need to be in survey or written form so that it's even more uninhibited? So we do have to take that into consideration. And so there is risk, and we'll talk in a moment about, there's bias, right? In terms of how the interviewer asks the questions, the rapport between the interviewer and the participant, that can change how the respondent answers questions. So of course, the risk with an interview as a research method is that the interviewer, the researcher, and how that researcher behaves and how they are perceived can highly influence the responses. When you go towards a survey, how the questions are worded can influence the responses. So we have different biases we have to consider as we are designing our research process. And we'll get into those biases in a later video. All right, singular viewpoint without the influence of others. The benefit of an interview is that it can be conducted anywhere. So you can go to the CEO's office and visit them for an executive interview. You can call people on the phone and do an interview. So there is that flexibility. It doesn't require the infrastructure, the setting that you would need for, say, a focus group. Okay. And the kicker here, an important one, is it's the only viable technique when a focus group would require competitors to be in the same room. Okay. So again, if it is more personal, more private information, or where it's information that you wouldn't want to say in front of a competitor, then you're doing interviews. Disadvantages of interviews is that, as we said before, it is more expensive. It's time consuming, right? Each person who participates is taking an hour. A focus group, 1 hour, was 8 to 12 people. If you're doing 12 interviews, you're now looking at 12 hours. Okay. It can be more difficult to get participants. Definitely more difficult than a survey. It's already difficult to get executives, leadership within organizations, professionals, lawyers, doctors to participate in research at all. And so trying to get them to participate is difficult. In an executive interview or one-on-one, they might be more willing to give you some time. You might be very limited. You get 30 minutes. In terms of getting participation, surveys have much higher participation rate than interviews and focus groups because people can do it, for example, at a time convenient for them. If it is, something they got through email, for example, they can do it when they have a couple seconds. As well as the time commitment for surveys are usually 10 to 15 minutes, as opposed to interviews, which are an hour. The other challenge is that the time to get feedback. So we talked about one of the benefits of a focus group is that you essentially have this instant analysis, that moderator debrief. You immediately have a feeling as to how multiple people feel. The survey takes longest because we have to code it and analyze it. The interviews, it will take more time to get feedback, But that's because you're doing one person, then the next person, then the next person. So it takes more time to get feedback from the same number of people than, say, like a focus group of 12 people would have taken an hour. Now you got to do 12 hours of interviews. We do, if we compare it to the focus group, we lose the information that we obtained from our participants talking to each other, which means you're only going to gather information that either the interviewer, the researcher, is asking for, or the participant really wants to volunteer that information and put it out there. So it is going to be in terms of where that topic goes. You're not going to have necessarily the breadth of different ideas that you would in, say, a focus group where people feed off of each other. And then the other challenge we have is that the results, the analysis is going to have a lot of subjectivity to it. We talked about the impact of the interviewer on the interview itself in terms of how the researcher is being perceived, as well as that rapport they build. That means how that will impact how reluctant the participant is to provide information and what direction they go in the discussion. And so that interviewer is going to have a lot of impact on the results of the interview. And what is taken away from and what is learned is really going to be subject to interpretation by the interviewer. What did they take away from the discussion? Often you will have transcripts. You might record the interview and then transcribe it to help and do your analysis. Again, that analysis method is going to be similar to focus groups, which is we are looking for general themes. We are looking for ideas. It's kind of a notes and quotes thing where you're going to identify, here's the topics they talked about, and use quotes from them, from that transcript, to support the ideas and the themes that you have discovered. So let's practice here conducting an in-depth interview. So if you have someone that you encounter today, pick a topic and ask them about it. Ask them maybe about the last purchase that they made, why they made it, how they went about making that decision. So practice here in terms of probing and also being responsive and flexible in terms of taking the conversation where that interviewee wants to go. And how are you able in terms of probing and getting more detail out of that conversation?